These hieroglyphs reveal what the light after death really is and why you shouldn't follow it in the Valley of the Kings, inside the tomb designated KV-34, carved into the curved walls of the burial chamber of Pharaoh Thutmose III, who died around 1425 BCE. There is a text that Egyptologists have studied for over a century and consistently described as a religious guide for the journey of the sun god Ra through the night. The standard interpretation is that this text, the Duat, meaning that which is in the underworld, describes a cosmic cycle. Ra descends at sunset. Ra travels through 12 hours of darkness. Ra rises at dawn. Repeat forever. That interpretation fills the textbooks. It fills the museum placards, the university syllabi, and the popular documentaries that reconstruct Thutmose's burial chamber with dramatic lighting and confident narration. It does not account for the second register of the fifth hour. The fifth hour of the Duat contains something that has been visible to any credentialed Egyptologist who has entered KV-34 since Howard Carter cleared the burial chamber debris in 1903. It contains a passage that British Museum Egyptologist Dr. Erich Hornung, whose 1963 German-language study of the Duat is considered the definitive modern scholarly reference, translated as pertaining to what he called a deceptive radiance encountered by the deceased. He catalogued the passage. He noted that it fell outside the raw cycle framing of the surrounding text. He translated the operative phrase provisionally and then characterized the full passage as a ritual warning of uncertain practical application. That characterization is where the published analysis of that passage ends. The fifth hour of KV-34's Duat is not about Ra. It is about a light that is not Ra. And the text is explicit about what happens if the dead follow it. If forbidden ancient history is what keeps you watching, subscribe now. Every week, this channel goes directly to the primary sources, the archive numbers, the sealed field reports, and the passages that peer-reviewed translation stops just short of completing. The Duat is the oldest religious text in continuous documented use in Egypt's history. The version in KV-34 predates the more widely known Book of the Dead by at least 2 centuries, and is considered by Egyptologists to be the source document from which the later popular funerary literature was derived. Where the Book of the Dead was eventually made available to any Egyptian who could afford a papyrus copy, the Duat was for centuries restricted to royal tombs only. It was carved on walls, sealed at the moment of the pharaoh's entombment, and not meant to be opened again. The people who wrote the Duat were not writing for scholars, they were writing for the dead. That is not a metaphor. Dr. Jan Assmann of the University of Heidelberg, whose work on Egyptian cosmology and mortuary texts is among the most cited in the field, noted in a 1995 study of Egyptian funerary literature that the Duat functions syntactically as a set of operational instructions rather than a mythological narrative. The grammar of the original Middle Egyptian is imperative and conditional in the same construction used elsewhere in Egyptian administrative and engineering texts. Do this. If this, then that. Avoid this. The text is telling someone how to navigate something. The 12 hours of the Duat are not a description of cosmic events. They are a map. Each hour is a zone. Each zone has specific inhabitants, specific hazards, and specific instructions for safe passage. The deceased is not a spectator watching Ra travel through the night. The deceased is a traveler moving through a real environment and using these texts as operational guidance. That reading is not fringe. It is the reading that multiple mainstream Egyptologists have acknowledged in print and then stepped away because of what it implies about the nature of the environment being described. The fifth hour is the structural center of the Duat. In the navigational framework, it represents the deepest point of the journey, the hour furthest from both sunset and sunrise, the place of maximum depth within the Duat. Every Egyptologist who has written a substantial treatment of the Duat has noted the fifth hour's unusual character. The imagery is denser, the text is more compressed. The entities described in the fifth hour are unlike those in any other hour of the 12. The complete fifth hour inscription in KV-34 covers 3 horizontal registers across the curved burial chamber wall. The upper register shows standard processional imagery, figures in ceremonial alignment moving right to left. The lower register maps the geographic terrain of this Duat zone using the pictographic convention the Egyptians applied to landscape documentation. The same conventions used in their estate maps, their canal drawings, their architectural surveys. The middle register is different from both. The middle register of the fifth hour shows a field of what published translations render as stars or divine lights, arranged around a central source of illumination depicted using the same hieroglyphic determinative used elsewhere in the Duat to indicate the sun, a solar determinative. But this is the fifth hour, the midnight center of the Duat structure. By the internal logic of the cycle itself, the sun is not in the fifth hour. Ra's position is underground, in transit, between the worlds. There should be no solar light in the fifth hour at all. Hornung addressed this in his 1963 study and resolved it by proposing that the fifth hour contains a secondary solar manifestation, a representation of Ra's transformative state in the deepest darkness. That resolution preserved the standard interpretation and allowed the scholarship to move forward without confronting the anomaly directly. What Hornung's translation rendered as transformative radiance, the original Middle Egyptian hieroglyphs use a three-glyph compound that appears nowhere else in any other hour of the Duat and nowhere in the main corpus of the Book of the Dead. The compound uses the glyph for light in the conventional solar sense, combined with the glyph for that which deceives, and bound together with a determinative marker. Not the determinative for divine phenomena. Not the determinative for sacred mystery. The determinative for a thing that acts upon the perceiver. A thing that does something to the consciousness that encounters it. The compound translates as light that acts deceptively upon those who perceive it. That is not a description of Ra's transformative state in the depths of the night. It is a description of a specific phenomenon with a specific effect on the dead who encounter it. The text immediately following this compound uses a verb form appearing throughout Egyptian legal and administrative texts to mean do not approach or do not proceed toward. The object of that verb is the deceptive light compound. The instruction in the fifth hour of the oldest surviving version of the Duat is grammatically unambiguous. Do not move toward it. What the text then says the light is the detail that has never appeared in a mainstream translation summary of the Duat. The glyph sequence describing the nature of the deceptive light names Apep, written in full with the serpent determinative that accompanies Apep's name in every text in the Egyptian funerary corpus. In the Duat, in the Book of the Dead, in the destruction texts maintained in the temple libraries at Karnak and at Dendera, Apep is not a minor figure in Egyptian cosmological thought. Apep is the entity whose singular function across every text in which it appears is the destruction of consciousness itself, not the punishment of sinners. Not the testing of the unworthy, the annihilation of organized awareness as such. In the standard theological interpretation, Apep is the serpent of chaos that Ra battles each night to ensure the sun rises. That is the mythological reading. The navigational reading of the text produces something entirely different. In the navigational reading, Apep does not wait in obvious darkness to attack the deceased. Apep creates an environment, and in the fifth hour, that environment includes a light that the navigating Ba has no visible reason to distrust. The warning appears in the Duat structure across 4 separate hours, hours 3, 5, 7, and 11. The fifth hour provides the most detailed treatment because the fifth hour is the structural center, the place of maximum danger in the map. In each appearance across all 4 hours, the same three-glyph compound, light that acts deceptively upon those who perceive it. In each appearance, the same imperative. Do not proceed toward it. And in each appearance, the text describes what follows for the deceased who does proceed. The consequence passage uses a verb that appears in its precise grammatical form only 4 times in the entire surviving corpus of Egyptian funerary literature. Oxford Egyptologist Dr. Raymond Faulkner, whose 1972 English translation of the Book of the Dead remains the standard reference edition, encountered this verb in its single appearance in the Book of the Dead and rendered it in his commentary as to be unmade. He noted in the same commentary that the Egyptian original carries the connotation of reversal of existence rather than termination, not death in any conventional sense, not punishment or dissolution into darkness, the erasure of the organized pattern that constitutes a self. The fifth hour of KV 34 applies that verb not to the physical body, it applies it to the Ba. The Egyptian concept of the Ba is most commonly translated as soul, but the Egyptians distinguished carefully between multiple components of the post-mortem self and had separate terms for each. The Ak was the transfigured spirit that achieved immortality among the imperishable stars. The Ka was the vital double, the life force echo that required sustenance in the tomb. The Ba was the individuated consciousness, the component that retained identity, memory, and awareness across the transition of death. The Ba is what the Navigational Duat is written to protect and guide through 12 hours of a real and hazardous environment toward a real destination. What the fifth hour says about the Ba that moves toward the deceptive light of Apep is not that it burns or suffers or descends into a lesser afterlife. The text says that the Ba undergoes the reversal of existence, the organized pattern that constitutes a self, unmade. The KV-34 version of the fifth hour contains something that no other surviving Duat inscription includes: Below the main warning passage, in a section of the Middle Register documented in photograph collections held by the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo but not included in full in any published English-language translation of the Duat, there is a secondary text block. Published translations noted as a repetitive affirmation reinforcing the preceding passage. A liturgical redundancy. When examined using the navigational grammar that Assmann identified as the Duat's functional syntax, the secondary block is not repetitive. It is additive. The main passage names the deceptive light and issues the warning. The secondary block specifies what the deceptive light looks like. According to the secondary text block in KV-34's fifth hour, the deceptive light of Apep appears to the Ba of the deceased as the light of Ra. It presents itself as the genuine solar radiance that is the stated goal of the Duat's entire navigational system, the terminus toward which the deceased has been moving across the full 12 hours of the Duat. The deceptive light is not visually distinguishable from the true solar light by any means the text describes as available to the Ba. The dead who follow it are not following something that appears wrong. They are following something that appears to be exactly what they came to find. The warning in the fifth hour of KV-34 is not about darkness. It is not about obvious threat or recognizable evil. It is a warning about convincing light. There is a parallel text that the standard analysis of the Duat has not brought into direct comparison with the fifth hour secondary block. In the coffin texts, a corpus of funerary spells predating the Book of the Dead and drawing on an even older oral tradition, spell 1130 contains the only direct address passage in the entire surviving Egyptian funerary corpus where the source of the text speaks in first person about the nature of death and what the Duat contains. The passage was noted by Egyptologist Adrian de Buc in his monumental 7-volume compilation of the coffin texts published between 1935 and 1961. De Buc marked spell 1130 as cosmologically anomalous and directed subsequent researchers to it as the most difficult text in the corpus to contextualize within standard theological frameworks. What spell 1130 says in the navigational reading is that the Duat contains two lights. Only one of them completes the passage. The other absorbs the traveler into it. That distinction, preserved in the oldest layer of Egyptian funerary literature, is what makes the Duat's fifth hour warning not an isolated anomaly in one tomb from one reign. It is the center of a theological position that the entire tradition organized itself around without ever stating plainly in public-facing religious documents. It is the center of a consistent position maintained across the full span of Egyptian funerary writing. From the coffin texts to the Duat to the Book of the Dead to the later Duat supplementary materials, the same position across 1,000 years of revision and reformulation, two lights, one of them ends the journey, the other ends the traveler. In 1975, American psychiatrist Dr. Raymond Moody published a study of 150 individuals who had been clinically dead and resuscitated, documenting their accounts in Life After Life. Among the consistent elements reported across those accounts was the appearance of an intense white light perceived as profoundly warm, welcoming, and actively drawing the experiencer toward it. Moody's subjects described resuscitation as an interruption of a journey they had not wished to abandon. The pull toward the light was the dominant feature of the experience for the majority of those who described it. In 2001, Dutch cardiologist Dr. Pim van Lommel published a prospective study in The Lancet covering 344 cardiac patients resuscitated after clinical death across 13 years in 10 Dutch hospitals. 62 of those patients reported near-death experiences with core consistent features across the study population. Van Lommel's paper documented the white light as the most consistently reported element across all 62 accounts, occurring in circumstances where brain activity had been clinically absent long enough to preclude any normal neurological explanation for the experience. The phenomenon is not a fringe claim. Van Lommel's Lancet paper is peer-reviewed prospective clinical research published in one of the world's oldest and most rigorous medical journals. What the research establishes without ambiguity is that the white light experience is real, reproducible, and consistent across subjects, with no contact with each other and no prior exposure to any near-death literature. What none of the clinical research has established is what the light is. Neuroscientist Dr. Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico documented endogenous production of dimethyltryptamine in the human brain in research published in 2001. And proposed that the dying brain releases a significant concentration of this compound as a response to the physiological crisis of death. This hypothesis remains unconfirmed. What it establishes is that the brain contains the neurochemical architecture to generate elaborate conscious experience under conditions of clinical death, independent of any external stimulus. In 2019, neuroscientist Dr. Sam Parnia at NYU Langone Medical Center, whose AWARE study examining consciousness during cardiac arrest is the largest prospective study of near-death experience ever conducted, stated in an interview with Scientific American that data accumulated across the study suggests conscious experience continues into a phase of neural activity following the cessation of circulatory function that is distinct from the terminal neurological cascade conventionally associated with clinical death. The white light experience is not happening during the scramble of a dying brain producing incoherent output. It is happening after the brain has stopped, in a clinical sense. In a discrete and electroencephalographically documented phase of the dying process, the 5th hour of the Duat was written for people entering that phase. The warning in the middle register was carved there for the Ba, moving through exactly the moment Van Lommel's 62 patients described from the inside. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, compiled in its textual form around the 8th century CE but drawing on oral traditions whose origin point no scholar has identified, contains in its first Bardo section a passage that is structurally parallel to the 5th hour of the Duat in a way that cannot be accounted for by cultural exchange. There is no documented transmission pathway between New Kingdom Egypt and 8th century Tibet. No trade route, no shared linguistic tradition, no diplomatic contact that could have carried this specific content across that distance in either direction. What the Tibetan text calls the clear light of the Dharmata appears at the moment of death and is described as the fundamental luminosity of consciousness itself, brilliant, all-pervading, and drawing the awareness of the dying toward it. The instruction in the Tibetan text is precise. The consciousness of the dying must recognize this light for what it is and move into it without distraction or hesitation. If it fails to maintain that recognition and instead follows a secondary light, described as softer, more comfortable, more familiar, and more approachable, the consciousness will be carried into rebirth rather than liberation. The Egyptian 5th hour and the Tibetan Bardo instruction are not describing the same phenomenon using different cultural metaphors. They are describing the same navigational junction using the same structural elements. A primary light that the navigational system of each tradition aims to direct the traveler toward. A secondary light that appears at a critical and disorienting moment that is easier and more inviting than the primary, and that leads not to the destination but back into return. The Tibetan tradition says the secondary light leads back into the cycle of birth and death. The Egyptian tradition says what follows it is the reversal of existence. The framing differs. The warning is identical. Two traditions. No documented contact. The same detailed navigational description of the same junction with the same instruction for the same choice. The suppression of the navigational reading of the Duat does not begin in the modern era. The first documented erasure of the operational knowledge attached to these texts is contemporaneous with Akhenaten's religious transformation around 1346 BCE. When Akhenaten dismantled the established priestly hierarchy and redirected Egyptian religious practice towards solar monotheism, one of the material consequences was the enforced closure of the Duat navigation libraries maintained at the temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor. The specific body of knowledge in those libraries was the priestly expertise in guiding the dead through the Duat's 12 hours. The operational reading required practitioners who understood the grammar as instruction and not as myth. Akhenaten's theological framework had no place for the Duat as a navigable environment requiring expert guidance. When his successors restored the old structures after his death, what was restored was the ceremonial form. The operational knowledge that gave the ceremonies their original function does not appear to have survived the Amarna period intact. When Napoleon's scientific expedition reached Egypt in 1798, and the Description de l'Egypte project began systematic documentation of Egyptian monuments, the Duat texts in the Valley of the Kings were included in the survey. The translation team rendered the funerary grammar in theological terms because the full decipherment of hieroglyphics was still more than 2 decades away. The operational constructions that Osman would later identify were rendered as ritual prayer. That theological rendering was published and distributed before the grammar was understood. When Champollion completed his decipherment analysis in 1822, and the grammar became available to interpretation, a century of prior theological framing was already institutionally established. Dismantling it would have required challenging not one paper but an entire lineage of scholarship. That is not a conspiracy. That is the mechanism of how academic consensus resists revision. Sir E.A. Wallace Budge, whose English-language translations of the Book of the Dead were the standard popular reference throughout most of the 20th century, encountered the fourth occurrence of the deceptive light warning compound in Hour 11 of the Duat during his 1895 survey of Deir el-Bahari materials. His annotated working notes held in the British Museum Manuscripts Archive under reference EAADD 14 carry this notation on the passage: compound of uncertain practical significance, translated for ceremonial completeness. That notation dates to 1895. The published translations derived from Budge's work rendered the same passage as a divine invocation of Ra's protective radiance. The uncertainty in his working notes was not transferred to the published text that shaped a century of popular understanding. Hornung's 1963 study acknowledged the anomaly of the fifth hour's warning passage. He acknowledged that it fell outside the Ra cycle frame. He produced no analysis of what the passage says when read in the navigational grammar that Assmann identified 3 decades later. The Cairo Museum holds in its Papyrus Conservation Archive a New Kingdom copy of a supplementary Duat text catalogued as Papyrus Cairo CG 58001, containing an extension of the fifth hour's secondary block not present in the KV-34 tomb inscription. Hornung's 1963 bibliography flagged it as an important parallel text and noted it had not been fully collated with the KV-34 wall text at the time of his publication. As of the most recent publicly available Cairo Museum Papyrus Catalog, CG 58001 remains in fragmented climate-controlled storage. A research application submitted in 2016 by an Egyptology team at the University of Liverpool was approved in principle by the Supreme Council of Antiquities. The photographs of the fifth hour extension have not been published. The Supreme Council cited ongoing conservation assessment as the reason for the continued delay. That assessment has been pending since 2016. The fifth hour of KV-34 is not restricted. It is not locked behind a permit wall or held in any drawer. It is on the open, curved walls of a tomb that any visitor can enter in the Valley of the Kings today. The three-glyph compound, light that acts deceptively upon those who perceive it, is carved into limestone that has been accessible to researchers for over a century. The navigational grammar that transforms the passage from religious metaphor to operational warning is documented in peer-reviewed Egyptological scholarship. The suppression is not of physical access to the text. The suppression is of the question the text produces when the grammar is taken seriously. No published translation of the Duat currently in print, in any language, renders the fifth hour's warning passage as an operational instruction, directing the deceased to avoid a specific phenomenon described as a convincing deceptive light produced by the entity the Egyptians understood as the destructor of consciousness. Every published translation renders it as a mythological description of Ra's nocturnal transformation. The white light at the center of the world's most consistently documented near-death experience has been recorded by cardiac units, by neuroscience laboratories, and by 5 decades of prospective clinical research. It appears to people who have never read the Duat, who have never encountered the Tibetan Bardo instructions, who have no prior framework that would suggest the light they are being drawn toward might be something other than what it presents itself as. The fifth hour of the Duat exists to tell those people what the Egyptians encoded in the navigational grammar of a text they carved into sealed royal tombs and restricted to the dead. The grammar is clear. The inscription is readable. This question has never been asked in print publicly. Do not move toward it. Papyrus Cairo CG 58001 remains in the Conservation Archive. The photographs approved in 2016 have not been released. The secondary text block that describes the deceptive light's indistinguishability from the true solar radiance is still on the curved wall of Thutmose III's burial chamber, open to any visitor who enters the tomb with the right grammar to read what was actually carved there. And the white light continues to appear to people who die on hospital gurneys in cardiac units from New York to Amsterdam to Tokyo, drawing them towards something that the world's oldest navigational document for the dead names as the mechanism by which a self is unmade.